and you had a really interesting article because we had, it's Christmas time, of course, and Taryn March wrote an article about her experiences.
Right. She did, and actually this is actually may segue into something else that was in the news this week. I think, like Mike said, Taryn had Taryn March actually wrote a beautiful story about. Oddly enough, the Paradise Fire, the Camp Fire that pretty much everybody in the United States has heard of. 88 people died, 14,000 homes leveled, about half the businesses in Paradise also burned to the ground. It's pretty much a major catastrophe here in Northern California.
We should remind people it's 8 miles.
It's just eight or 10 miles up the hill from Chico. Taryn no longer lives in Paradise. Her home survived, but she decided she did not want to live in a wasteland, so she is living somewhere else right now. But her column really isn't about the fire. Her column is about stories, about how we all have stories. Stories are who we are. What we do is very often a reflection of our story, our interests or our background, or sometimes good or bad. Or story is just how we ended up where we are, how we ended up at our work, how we ended up living where we live, whatever. There's a story behind all of that. I think of some of the stories of people I've worked with. I've worked with physicists who were also musicians, a software engineer who acted in light opera, a brilliant electronics engineer, a really good friend of mine who was an aerobatic pilot, a co-worker who, get this, had his PhD in physics and was doing physics software programs, software engineer for physics purposes, who left his job in Silicon Valley to be a machinist, because his story, his background just didn't fit his degree. I mean, he got it, but he really liked precision machining, and he left his good paying job in Silicon Valley to become a machinist. Each had a job and a story that reflected who they were. And sometimes you don't see those stories until you see a coworker or a friend or an acquaintance in a different context. Now, Taryn tells one story about a Paradise resident named John. He's a musician, a cellist with the local symphony. Paradise, a small town, but it actually had a very nice little local symphony. Taryn writes that, and this is her speaking here, like many in the town, John, and you see him there, managed to live frugally but creatively. You might say his social skills were overlooked in favor of his musical genius, but that genius made up for any imagined lack. And anyway, he is a mild, kind, and thoughtful man. His hair sticks out like Einstein's.
You can see it right there.
You can see it right there. When the fire arrived, John discovered his car didn't work, or he couldn't work his car. Didn't really matter which, he still had to act. So he strapped his cello to his back, made an unsuccessful grab for the cat, and climbed on his bicycle. He pedaled out of harm's way, and when he got tired, he coasted to the side of the road and stopped. He climbed off his bike, uncased his cello, and started playing with the lurid glow of the town behind him as backdrop. John did this because it's his job. It's his job to make music. That is his story. So that's what Taryn wrote. That's beautiful. The whole piece, the whole article is really great. I suggest you read it. The link is down there below the player. So, but really, as beautiful as that story is, and as beautiful as the story about John is, it's no less beautiful than the stories each of us have. We may not have the glow of a city burning behind us as we play our cello, but our story is still unique and beautiful. Going back to the story later, a week or so, several weeks later, not far from where John played his cello alongside the road, there were linemen stringing up new power lines, city workers checking water mains, and an entire slew of infrastructure technicians doing what they do, telling their own story by doing their jobs. And you might be thinking, your story isn't that dramatic, maybe, but I am pretty certain that we can all tell work stories that reflect who we are. Many of us have taken work skills and applied them in non-work situations, or taken our non-work skills and applied them to our job. We do these things because that's who we are. Our story and who we are is made up of everything we've experienced up to this point right now. So why is this important? Why am I talking about it? It's important because I think especially today, we don't often see people for who they are, whether we're talking about immigrants or politicians or even our coworkers. It's just, a coworker is just somebody I work with, and I know this person only in the context of his or her job. And I think it's too easy to think of our coworkers as just coworkers, this person who just does something, as if that is it. But it isn't. They all have a story. Just like you have a story and I have a story, and that story right now culminates in being with you at your job and next to you doing your job. What's their story? How did they get there? How did you get where you're at? What does that say about how you both do your jobs or how you view your jobs? And I think this is important because I think if you understand the context and the story behind any person, whether it's a coworker or, like I said, a politician. General Mattis is in the story right now. We're hearing a lot of the background about Mattis because we need to put that in context with his recent resignation as Secretary of Defense. Because it makes sense. When you know a story, you understand why a person does something. That applies to a coworker as well. If I understand where you're coming from, if I know your background and so forth, then I understand maybe how you do what you do and why you do what you do and what your motivation is for what you do. And I think that's important as coworkers. I think it's also important as managers to employees and employees to managers, understanding where they're coming from. I think without that context, without the story, we don't understand each other well enough to be able to work well together. Absolutely. And I think that's critical.
It is. My wife is a social worker. She's a therapist.
Right.
And she has clients that she talks to all the time. And she has a plaque in her office that she refers to a lot. And she says, be kind because everyone is fighting a hard battle. And it's really true.
It's true.
Everybody you know, everybody you meet, you're wrapped up in what you're doing in that moment.
Right.
And everybody you meet is wrapped up in what they're doing in their moment. They have a struggle.
Yeah, everybody has a
Everybody's
struggle.
got a struggle.
Yeah.
Everybody's fighting a battle to do something. And it's hard. It's hard for them. They're probably not sharing with you how hard it really is. And it's not just because they don't want to burden you with it. They don't want to burden themselves by reminding themselves of it. But you can unburden them and unburden yourself by asking.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine, anytime he met, I mean, it was kind of cheesy in a way, but in retrospect, I'm going, it's actually kind of a good idea. Anytime he met somebody new, he would ask them, so, Frank, what's your story?
Yeah.
That's how and it was kind of like, what do you mean, what's your story? And then you would have, where are you from? What did you do? I mean, what interests you? I mean, he was really just to kind of get a background on this person to get them to talk about things that maybe they wouldn't normally talk about. But for him, it was like, hey, if I know your story, then I know a lot more about you. I know how I can relate to you because I understand where you're coming from.
And I mean, I've increasingly become a political guy.
Right.
And in politics, this is an important thing that we've lost this ability to understand people's stories because, many of us are going to be gathered around tables with family and friends and loved ones next week, Christmas, and for New Year's. And many people are going to avoid certain topics. Politics or something people are going to avoid talking about. And to me, that's sad. I mean, to me, it's like, well, you know what? You should talk about politics. You should understand where you're coming from. You should explain yourself to one another without rancor.
Right.
Don't get upset. Don't feel like you can't say things. Express your beliefs, but again, remember, people have their own beliefs. They're fighting a hard battle. Give them the grace to let them feel the way they feel without you feeling you have to impose what you believe on them, but share what you believe so you can have an exchange about it. That ultimately, people say, how are we going to heal these divides we have in the country? That's the way to do it, folks. I mean, that's the way you do it, is by listening with compassion and sharing your own story with compassion.
And I think that applies. I think that applies in the workplace as well.
Sure.
I think very often there's just a complete. Very often in the workplace, particularly where you have tension, I think a lot of that tension is just because we see this other person in a certain context Oh, I'm sorry. We see this other person with a lack of context. We just see, well, I don't like what he or she said or what they did, or my boss made me do this job. Why would they do that? My boss is a jerk, that kind of thing, without understanding, wait, where are they coming from? And actually, where are you coming? Why does doing this job bother you?
Right.
You know, I mean,
why does the way that person is doing their job bother you? Because I mean, you know, when you get sensitive to it and you begin to look at what is going on, you say somebody pushes my buttons.
Right.
Okay. You can actually diagnose that. You can self-diagnose that. Okay. Right. What is happening? How is the button being pushed? What led up to that? How do I feel about it? What's coming into my mind when I think about it? You can begin to self-diagnose that, and you can diffuse it. It takes some work. I mean, it doesn't just happen like that. It doesn't certainly happen from listening to me talk about it. You got to really investigate it, but you can do that. And yeah, you can really heal those things. You can because you have to remember, you can never control somebody else. Right. You never ever can. At least not for good. You can control people short term.
Yeah, if you're a boss, you can control them short term, but that's about all you're doing. Yeah.
But you can control yourself. You can control the way you respond to it, and you can diffuse things. You can actually change somebody's behavior by changing your own and getting out of the cycle. Right. These are complicated things, you know. These aren't things that are easy. Like I say, they don't happen very quickly in human interdynamic relationships, but they can change. They can happen. Yeah. And Terrence Story did a great job of talking about that.
So your New Year's resolution: ask all your coworkers, hey, what's your story?
And
they'll look at you like you're pretty weird.
And your loved ones.
And
Maybe you never did that with your brother or your mom or your wife or or your kid. Hey, what's your story? What Yeah. It can help. It really can.